Welcome back, everyone. In this video, we are going to learn about how to perform a payment using Stripe. Now, Stripe in this particular case is what actually provides us with this credit card information. Because I'm in a testing environment, you will see that the automatic credit card is being disabled, but these are all different things that we'll learn about when integrating with Stripe. In this particular case, we're able to insert a Stripe number with test cards, of course, which is what we're using. And then from here, we can create a payment which will fire off into a serverless function that we will learn about that will then complete the actual checkout, and we can see it logged inside of our Stripe dashboard. So we're going to learn all about payment integrations from the front end as well as serverless functions in this upcoming section. So in order to begin our high-level discussion, I want to focus on Stripe first. We know that with web development, we have a front end and a back end. The front end is primarily where we've worked with all of our code throughout this course. All of our React code lives on the front end. We have not actually written any back end code at all. With Stripe, though, Stripe is a service that lives outside of our front end and our back end applications. Stripe has their own servers, Stripe has their own API, and we on our application, the combination of our front end and back end, if we potentially had a back end, would have to interact with these Stripe APIs in order to perform a payment using Stripe. This is a very key concept when it comes to using any external third-party applications that provide a service to our application. In our particular case, Stripe provides the payment service, which is what we want to leverage inside of our app. The way that Stripe can identify our application to us is that it provisions us a secret key. But the key word here is that it's a secret. If we were to keep this secret key on our front end, which is a very common thing that you will notice, is that a lot of third-party applications will give you a secret key. If you keep it on the front end and you try to make a payment request from your front end, passing the secret key to Stripe so that Stripe knows that this is you, you'll notice that Stripe will block this payment because you are not allowed to keep that secret key on the front end because there is very limited security on the front end. Instead, what you have to do is keep that secret key on the back end. So what we need to do is be able to make a request to make a payment to the back end. The back end, which has the secret key, then communicates and makes a request to Stripe so that a payment can be made. From here, Stripe will then allow us to make this payment because it can tell that this is not coming from some front-end browser. So this is a very key pattern that we need to know about using Stripe. We have to set up some kind of backend. Now, when you think about backends are very typical. Essentially, from a front end, we make some kind of request to a backend, and the backend sends us back a response. Now, where is this separation between front end and backend? Front end is pretty much anything that has to do with user interaction and the logic that comes from a user interacting on a browser website. The backend is anything beyond that. Backend coding typically has a lot of database interaction, a lot of cross-service interaction, a lot of data management, a lot of service management, anything that has to do with DevOps, infrastructure, which involves scaling up and scaling down the amount of resources, which we'll talk about. But backend is in itself a very large beast, and any API that we interact with on the front end is typically speaking with a backend server. For us, of course, we have not built any backend, but as we saw with Stripe, we need to have some kind of backend in order for us to actually complete a payment request to Stripe. So here what I'm going to talk about is serverless functions, which is something that makes this process significantly easier for us who are primarily focused on front-end and learning React, because React is not a back-end thing. So what we got to do to understand backend, though, is traditionally how backends work. As I mentioned, there are servers. A server is pretty much what you can imagine your computer to be. There is some hardware that has something to do with memory as well as performance speed. So memory in this case exists in two forms. You have RAM, which is pretty much immediate memory, and then you have your disk, which is like your hard drive, which essentially is more long-term memory. So the immediate memory that comes from your RAM is very quick to access, but it's also something that disappears whenever the server restarts. In the particular case with your disk, which is your long-term memory, even if you restart the server, that data lives in there. But as a result, it's much more slower to actually update that data and retrieve that data. But these two things form the basis of your server. All of the additional code you write on top of that is leveraging these resources of your RAM and your disk. So backends are very similar. They're essentially these computers that don't have a user interface. It just has the resources. And then you host your backend code on these resources, and then your frontend makes requests to these servers. So you can see your backend as a combination of the servers and the supporting infrastructure that allows this to be done. So here, if a frontend makes a request to your backend, let's say, for example, we make on average 100 requests per minute. One server is probably enough to service all of these front-end requests. Maybe these requests ask for some data from the backend. Maybe we do some transformations. Maybe we send out emails. Whatever it is that we have to do through a server. Generally speaking, depending on your architecture, one server is probably enough to service these 100 requests per minute. The problem becomes when we start hitting massive scale. Let's say we hit the size of a company like Amazon or Google, where we're making 10K requests per minute from numerous frontends. At this point, your backend needs to scale up. One server cannot service all of these requests anymore. So you have to manually, or your developer team has to manually figure out how to code out systems that can scale up the number of servers in order to service these 10,000 requests. Now, remember, these requests do fluctuate because there are seasons. You can imagine that for a company like Amazon, during the holiday season, they get way more purchases and sales and therefore requests than they do perhaps in the earlier portions of the year or during down parts of the year. This means that they are constantly scaling up and down resources, and if they go back for some reason to 100 requests per minute during a season, they need to scale down the number of servers. So even in the middle, they have to be a variable amount of servers that go up and down. Sometimes you get 10,000, sometimes you get 2,000, sometimes you get 500, 100. The idea is that it changes, and correspondingly, there is a process involved that requires us manually scaling up and down the number of servers to serve these requests. This, however, costs money and time to do. It costs money because, of course, these resources, these servers, take up physical space in the real world, and therefore they need to be purchased, they need to be maintained, and this maintenance, as well as the code it takes to write to scale these up and down, takes time. This time comes from developers, which in turn also costs money. So for a company, building out their own backend that's scalable is often a very expensive endeavor. Especially for us who are just trying to learn React and need to make Stripe payments, having to set up all the infrastructure and consider all of these things for our backend is just largely a big waste of time as far as learning frontend goes. If you want to learn backend, it's an incredible learning experience. But again, we're trying to learn React. So in order for us to simplify the process of setting up a backend that simply allows us to just make these payments to Stripe, what we can leverage is serverless functions. Serverless functions is a very efficient way for us in order to perform these backend functionalities, but with very minimal resources and commitment on our end in order to set these up. So that's what we're going to talk about in the next video.